Hello and welcome to the first part in this comprehensive Viggen tutorial series where we will go through everything from flying to computer, navigation and weapons. As this is the first part in the series, we'll just go through some basic history, strengths and weaknesses, mission profile and then some basic cockpit familiarization. The entire series will be timestamped in the description if there's a particular part of a video you want to get to. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Alternatively, if you're looking for something specific, consulting the manual is always a good choice as everything is in there as well. The Viggen was developed in the 1960s as a strike aircraft which entered service in 1972, although several other models were later developed. The aircraft is notable for its early integration of a computer, its stall capability, and general quirkiness. The version we have in DCS is the modernized 1990s AGS variant, which has more modern weapons, 2 more weapon pylons for sidewinders, and in real life also reconnaissance capabilities. The Viggen is primarily made for completely pre-planned low-altitude strike missions where you release all weapons at once and then immediately get out of there. This is what most weapons are set up to do in real life as well as in the game. This is further compounded by the general inability to mix air-to-ground weapons except for a select few. Of course we have a greater ability to adapt the Viggen in the game than you'd have in real life, but it's still not as flexible as other Cold War birds. One of the greatest assets in the Viggen is its speed. You'll outrun most adversaries you typically face in the Cold War battlefield. However, you'll lose a lot of it if you try to dogfight due to the massive delta wings. That being said, it's not at all useless or harmless in a dogfight, and is quite often underestimated by a lot of pilots in these types of servers. With all of that out of the way, let's jump into the cockpit. Let's start from the back left. Here you'll find the slot for the data cartridge, a very important feature we'll come back to later. There's also the gear lever, which in the Viggen also controls the flaps, so when the gear's down the flaps will also drop automatically. Here's the gear interlock disconnect as well. Back here you'll also find the AFK, which functions as a very rudimentary auto throttle. Down here you'll find all of the internal light switches. This panel up here is almost completely non-functional except for the RB advance button, which switches the next missile, the Sidewinder audio knob, and the EP13 contrast and brightness knobs. Down here we have emergency trim for roll and pitch as well as a yaw trim. The small panel here is for radar brightness and the big panel is for the FR24, which is our backup radio. This big panel up here is mostly for radar stuff except for our master mode selector up here. The panel even further up is the engine controls and the canopy switch. This panel here is for the FR22, our main radio. The stuff hidden in here is not really much to worry about except for knowing that this is our pitch trim indicator and our roll trim center button. Up here neatly tucked away is the button for controlling all the warning lights and setting warning light brightness. Even more neatly tucked away up here is the taxi and landing light switch and emergency instrument light switch. This is the left warning panel. I'll go through all the warnings once we've gone through the cockpit. Alright, onto the main panel. Everything here should look fairly normal to anyone used to a plane interior, but as with everything in the plane, there are a few peculiarities. We can start at the bottom left again, where we see this golden lever, which is our thrust reverser. This is really useful if you want to parallel park, or perhaps if you want to land on short runways. This panel is where you select your radio frequency if you're in manual mode with the FR22. Then we have our main indicator cluster with speed, height and ADI. These are, as with everything in the Viggen, also odd. The airspeed indicator is in kilometers an hour and the altimeter is in meters with a QFE selector below. This will be very important when we get to the weapons later. Thankfully, the ADI is fairly standard. These buttons hidden up here are our autopilots. They're very rudimentary but still nice to have. Here's our master caution with a standard press to suppress, and hidden even further up is a standard AOA indicator. Snuggled between the AOA indicator and the HUD cover is a HUD position lever. In the center of the main panel is what is called the central indicator or CI. This panel houses the radar image, RWR ring, compass and altitude warning light. There's also a hidden button here to realign the compass in case of failure. The only working button down here on the pedestal is the parking brake. A note about the parking brake is they have to hold the brake to engage it and then let go of the brakes. Moving up and next to the HUD is the EP13, which is the Maverick sight. Hidden under there is a clock with a timer functionality. This is a light telling you whether your payload is fully dropped or not. Here is a non-quirky G gauge. These buttons are HUD settings. The left one is for HUD declutter when flying below 100 meters, among some other uses. And the right one is for displaying radar altitude or the manual set QFE altitude in the HUD. This displays the next waypoint in the flight plan, and the indicator below shows how far till the next waypoint in Scandinavian miles or kilometers, depending on how close you are. Below that is the fuel gauge in percent. All of the gauges to the left here are backup instruments or engine related, most of which are usually not important, except for this odd display which shows which afterburner zone you're in. Very useful for formation takeoffs and the like. Down here is the right warning panel, and further to the right we have 3 gauges, 2 of which are practically useless and 1 is semi-useful, yet another afterburner zone indicator, but this one displays where in the afterburner zone you are. This switch turns on oxygen for the pilot. This conglomerate of buttons and switches are all tied to the CK37 in some way, very important, but we'll get to all of that later. A lot of these switches up here have no function, and the ones that do are backup systems. These 2 buttons on the covers are emergency jettison, the top one for fuel tank, and the red one for weapons. The weapon jettison will drop all the weapons, including missiles and guns. The only things that won't be dropped are sidewinders on the outermost pylons. All of these are related to weapon settings, we'll get to those later. Up here are a couple of circuit breakers you'll probably never use. Here's the IFF panel, which you will never use. This big thing is the controller for the best missile in the universe, the RB-05. These are band selectors for the U-22 jamming pod, and this here is an airbase selector for the TIL system. TILs being eyeless, but more tactical. Here we have yet another panel with mostly non-functional switches, except for this magnetic declination correction dial. This panel houses the countermeasure pod settings as well as the RWR mode switch. This is the external light switch panel, and this down here is yet more non-functional IFF knobs as well as a non-functional position light brightness knob. Back here, however, is the most important button in the entire plane, the ground safety override. Oh, and I should also mention the ejection seat arming is above you. The warning panels mostly show faults that you only see during startup or if you're already practically dead. However, I'll point out some that you might see more frequently, such as X-Tank BRA, which indicates a fault in the fuel tank feed system. However, if you're below 70% RPM, so mostly on the ground, this will be illuminated anyway, although it's nothing to worry about. Landställ indicates that the gears are moving. Nosställ indicates that the nose wheel is down and locked, as does V and H ställ for left and right gear. Huv och stol will be illuminated if you forgot to close your canopy, but more probably forgot to arm the ejection seat. Syrgas will be illuminated if you forgot to turn on the oxygen valve. BRA 24 is if you've got less than 24% fuel left. Facklor slut indicates that your countermeasure pod is empty, and luftbroms means your air brake is extended. Aside from the basic binds such as pitch, roll, yaw, and throttle, the Viggen is actually quite simple in terms of binds. Well, it has a very basic stick and throttle since it's not really built around the HOTAS principle. We can still bind a lot of other stuff if you have enough buttons for it. A little tidbit, if you're completely new to DCS, this is what the bindings menu will look like when you just open it up. I like to have it on foldable view. It gives you these nice little categories here. You can open them all, close them all, and you can search all at once. First, I'd mention the optional but quite useful binds such as gears and, well, flaps if you have a switch for them, but also the master arm. However, as we've already established, the Viggen is quirky. So the master arm is a bit more important to have close at hand than the usual take off and then flip it on. The master arm in the Viggen is actually on top of the flight stick and is called trigger safety. In the Viggen, you do your entire flight with it on safe, and then just before you're about to shoot, you'd flip it off since it will actually impact some of the weapon's navigation in computer to leave it on. The only exception is if you're in the dogfight, then you'd flip it off and leave it there. This is still technically an optional bind since you can press the safety bracket on the stick instead. 2 quite useful binds are the axes called RB-05 stick, pitch, and yaw, as well as radar stick, horizontal and vertical. One obviously for the RB-05 missile and the other is for slewing the radar, but also controlling the RB-75 missiles, also known as Mavericks. There are quite a lot of other binds connected to the radar, but the only one that can't be pressed in the cockpit is the T-fix trigger, which consists of T0, T1 and TV-fix. These control the radar as well as, once again, the RB-75s. On the throttle is the IR missile uncage and missile fast select buttons, which can only be accessed by bindings. There's also the fast countermeasures dispense button. I hope you found this little walkthrough useful. In the next episode we'll actually start getting into how to operate the jet with a startup taxi, takeoff, landing, shutdown and general flight tutorial. If you found this useful, consider leaving a like so others may find it. And if you want to make sure not to miss any coming parts, then why not subscribe? Anyway, that's all I got.